Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Dozens of MPs have been protesting outside Parliament this afternoon, demanding its immediate recall after Scottish judges dramatically ruled that the current suspension of Parliament is illegal. The verdict of Scotland's highest civil court is that the Prime Minister is attempting to prevent MPs' scrutiny of the government's Brexit plans. Boris Johnson has repeatedly denied that, claiming the 5-week suspension is just normal practice. Well, Downing Street is to appeal against the ruling at the UK Supreme Court. The case is expected to be heard early next week. Well, let's talk to our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, who's at Westminster for us. Laura, just when it looked like things might calm down for a day or two, suddenly we have this ruling from the Scottish court. They don't believe Boris Johnson. They think what he's done is illegal.
That's right, not a bit of it, no calm round here. This controversial decision has already provoked scuffles in Parliament, fury outside with protesters gathering here outside Westminster, and now Boris Johnson and Downing Street have been judged by senior judges in Scotland to have fallen foul of the law. This is an argument that is getting more and more intense. The Prime Minister tonight caught in a tangle between Parliament, the Palace and Number 10.
Judgment Day. In Scotland's Court of Session, a clear verdict on Boris Johnson.
Each opinion expresses the view that the advice given by the Government to Her Majesty the Queen to prorogue Parliament from 9th September to 14th October was unlawful, and that therefore the prorogation itself is unlawful.
In plain language, the judges concluded Number 10 broke the law by telling the Queen they wanted to suspend Parliament for a break before unveiling their plans for government. And opposition MPs, jubilant at the ruling, suspected in fact they wanted to close down Parliament to avoid difficult questions on Brexit.
For every moment Parliament remains prorogued, the British government are breaking the law. So we, as politicians, are calling for Parliament to be recalled so that we can get on with scrutinising what this government is up to in relation to Brexit.
The court did not specifically order the government to open up the Commons, but some MPs who'd packed up just yesterday rushed back to demand it gets going again, taking their places in protest on the green benches in the empty chamber. With an impromptu rally at the doors.
We have shown in the last 10 days that we are prepared to work together across parties in the national interest, and our resolve remains absolutely firm that we will do that.
What do you actually propose to do now? Are you all going to stay here in the Palace of Westminster? Are you going to go and sit in the chamber?
We're going to go back into the building. We've all got jobs to be doing. We've got meetings to be taking place. We've all got constituents to be representing. And ultimately, we will find other ways of holding this government to account.
Labour, too, is pressing the Prime Minister for a return.
Whatever happens next week, we will continue to press for Parliament to be recalled so that we can question the Prime Minister.
Hang on, though. Scottish law is different to English law. And the High Court in London reached the opposite conclusion in a similar case brought by the businesswoman Gina Miller just days ago, deciding the Prime Minister's decision to close the Commons was actually none of the court's business.
Number 10 will appeal. A final verdict will be given by the UK Supreme Court next Tuesday. But this is as extraordinary as it is serious. The Prime Minister's actions are found to have been against the law. Downing Street ruled to have misled the Queen. Less than 2 months into office, Boris Johnson has hurtled into a genuine constitutional clash.
Number 10 denied they'd suggested the Scottish judges had been somehow biased. And for now, Cabinet Ministers are reluctant to be drawn into the tangle.
I'm not going to comment on an ongoing legislative process. It's a judicial issue and no doubt will be appealed to the Supreme Court.
Government insiders are curiously relaxed about the ruling. And some MPs and ministers reckon they'll still have many of the public on their side.
The government have acted legally, constitutionally and in normality. Farcical? Absolutely and completely. Not for the government, for the whole place. The fact of the matter is the people said we want to leave the European Union and this place says we don't.
That frustration is what Downing Street's banking on. A serious and important defeat in court for them today. But it seems lining up to take on Parliament is almost part of their ruthless approach. Laura Kuenssberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Let's talk to our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, who's in Edinburgh for us. Sarah, this ruling by Scottish judges says pretty plainly that in their view, Boris Johnson misled the Queen, MPs and the public.
Yes, well, the ruling from the Court of Session doesn't explicitly say that Boris Johnson lied to the Queen or tried to mislead voters, but if you dig into the complex legal jargon, you'll see that that is essentially what they're saying. Boris Johnson has repeatedly said, and his lawyers argued in the Court of Session, that it is perfectly normal for a new government to prorogue Parliament and that he wasn't trying to undermine democracy in any way. Well, the three senior judges at the Scottish Court of Session have essentially said today that they don't believe him, that they think it is his intention to try and undermine parliamentary scrutiny in the run-up to the UK's exit from the EU. They unanimously ruled that Mr Johnson was motivated by the improper purpose of stymieing Parliament, and that's the reason why they found that he was acting unlawfully. One of the three judges even went on to say that the prorogation was an egregious case of a clear failure to comply with generally accepted standards of behaviour of public authorities. So what they are essentially saying there in legalese is that they don't believe the reasons that the Prime Minister and his lawyers gave for why they decided to suspend Parliament, and essentially they're saying that he misled the Queen when he advised her to prorogue Parliament.
Sarah in Edinburgh, thank you. Well, let's talk now to Clive Coleman, who's at the Supreme Court, where the appeal will be heard next week. Dramatic, Clive, though this Scottish judgment is, it's all rather confusing because it's the direct opposite of what an English court ruled last week.
It's incredible, isn't it? You could scarcely have two more contradictory judgments. The Scottish one finding that the Prime Minister acted unlawfully because his improper purpose was to stymie Parliament. The judgment from the High Court in London finding that, look, advice given by the Prime Minister to the Queen isn't a legal matter at all. It's a political matter, and you can't judge it in a court of law. Now, those two contrary judgments are now hurtling towards this place, the UK Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, and in a hearing beginning next Tuesday, the contradiction between the two of them will be resolved, and we will get a definitive ruling as to whether the Prime Minister was acting unlawfully or not. And that will determine whether MPs and Parliament sit in the lead-up to the UK leaving the EU. And Fiona, this really is the UK Constitution in action. Independent judges acting through judicial review can halt the might of a government in its tracks if what ministers have done is unlawful, because as the lawyers like to say, be you ever so mighty, the law is above you.
Clive Coleman at the Supreme Court, thank you. Well, the Labour Party's Brexit strategy has come under pressure today. Deputy Leader Tom Watson made a speech this morning in which he said the party needs to have a referendum before a general election and campaign unambiguously to remain in the EU. That contradicts Jeremy Corbyn, who's promised a referendum after an election with Leave and Remain on the ballot paper. Mr Corbyn says Mr Watson's remarks are not official Labour policy. Our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, reports.
Their leader and deputy of the same party, though today you'd hardly know it, Jeremy Corbyn keeping open the question, does Labour back Leave or Remain? And Tom Watson facing the other way. Today, unlike his leader, he wanted another referendum before the election and a campaign to stay in, his way to win back lost supporters at election time.
They just want us to take an unequivocal position that whatever happens, we'll fight to remain, and to sound like we mean it. And if we did, we could win. Whereas if we don't, I fear we won't.
Mr Corbyn doesn't want to upset Leave or Remain voters, even if that upsets his deputy.
It's Tom's view. I don't accept it and I don't agree with it. Our priority is to get a general election in order to give the people a chance to elect a government that cares for them, not themselves.
At the TUC in Brighton, Mr Corbyn's gathered support among union leaders. His biggest supporters' counter-strike at Tom Watson wasn't just political, it was personal.
Now and again Tom pops up from wherever he's been hiding and comes up with something. Instead of supporting his leader, it's normally to try and undermine him, and I don't know why he does it. Less and less people listen to him. If he wants to continue to languish on the fringes of the Labour Party, that's up to him, but his views don't really matter anymore.
For months, Mr Corbyn's been under pressure from MPs and within his own shadow cabinet to come down more clearly on the Remain side of the debate. His inner circle see Tom Watson as a political enemy posing as a loyal colleague. But this rift mirrors a broader split between Jeremy Corbyn and many pro-EU party members in the country. Leeds North West is a battleground between Labour and the anti-Brexit Lib Dems. A harder pro-Remain policy here might please some voters, but not all.
Hopefully, yeah. I'd like to think it would. I think there's a lot of people that were misinformed, and I think now with everything that's happened with Brexit, I think it's time that, yeah, I think we should remain.
I think it would be welcomed.
Why?
I think there's a feeling that we're proud to be European.
I normally vote Labour, but at this time I will vote for either Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson, whoever wants to get us out of Europe, because Watson and Jeremy Corbyn are just useless. They do not believe in democracy or the will of the people.
Jeremy Corbyn may well get his way in this struggle, but Labour's annual conference is just over a week away, and the strains will be on show. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
We can talk to John now at Downing Street. So, John, let's just take stock after today. An almighty constitutional clash for the government and Labour's most senior leaders at odds over their Brexit policy.
Absolutely, Fiona. At this defining stage in the battle of Brexit, we're seeing not just argument, but real deep hostility between the government and its political opponents. We're seeing tension within the main opposition, the Labour Party. And of course, we're seeing the government, as things stand, at odds with the court. Whatever view you may hold for or against Brexit, for or against the government, or simply your view on the historic role of Parliament, and it's being drawn into a row that's being steadily pushed closer to boiling point. And things are about to get hotter. As I speak, we're waiting for the government to publish, against its will, on the orders of Parliament, its assessment of the possible impact of a no-deal Brexit. Now, thanks to leaks a few days ago in the Sunday press, we can expect them to set out the possibility of medicine shortages, of shortages on shelves in the high street, of possible chaos on transport routes to the continent of Europe. Ministers will, of course, say they don't expect things to work out that badly, even if we end up with no deal. But as things stand, MPs are unable to thrash this out because Parliament is closed. Now, that may close in coming days in the Supreme Court, but whether it does or whether it doesn't, the split that has riven this country, is splitting this country from end to end, is getting wider and deeper moment by moment, to the point that whatever happens with Brexit, with a possible extension of Brexit, with the coming election, maybe with a conceivable referendum, the wounds look so deep and so raw, it's impossible to imagine them healing, this country healing, anytime soon.
John in Downing Street, thank you.
Amid what is now a full-blown constitutional crisis, all eyes will be on the Supreme Court next week, when the country's top judges will decide whether Scotland's Court of Sessions was correct in ruling that the Prime Minister acted in an improper and unlawful way in suspending Parliament for 5 weeks. Opposition MPs leapt on the ruling, saying that Parliament should be recalled immediately. Former Attorney General and Tory rebel Dominic Grieve said that if Boris Johnson has misled the Queen over the reasons for prorogation, then he should resign. Our Scotland correspondent Kieran Jenkins has this.
Crisis no longer does it justice. 3 senior judges at Scotland's highest civil court ruled the Prime Minister illegally suspended Parliament.
The advice given by the government to Her Majesty the Queen to prorogue Parliament from 9th September to 14th October was unlawful, and that therefore the prorogation itself is unlawful.
Never before, surely, has a sitting Prime Minister been so stingingly rebuked in court.
It is an explosive outcome. The judges concluded that when Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, went to see the Queen to request that Parliament be prorogued, the advice he gave her was unlawful. And therefore, they say, the prorogation that followed is effectively voided now. It's null, they say, and has no effect.
Victory for more than 70 cross-party MPs and peers. The judges ruled Boris Johnson's real intention in suspending Parliament, which sparked chaos in the Commons overnight on Monday, was to avoid scrutiny ahead of Brexit.
I think what this victory shows is that the British government cannot act above the law. Boris Johnson, in the same way that I can't act above the law, Boris Johnson can't act above the law. And much as Boris Johnson might want to thumb his nose at the rule of law still runs in Scotland at least.
Downing Street said it was disappointed, sticking with the explanation dismissed by the court, uttered once again by Boris Johnson yesterday.
So there's a massive, massive agenda. We need a Queen's speech. That's why Parliament is in recess now, because you always have a recess before a Queen's speech. And anybody who says it's all this stuff about it being anti-democratic, I mean, donnez-moi un break.
A break is exactly what some MPs don't want. A few took their seats in an empty chamber after the ruling.
OK, so we're here today as a cross-party group of MPs.
Opposition MPs coming together in Westminster demanding Parliament be recalled.
We've gone in, we've seen that Parliament is not sitting. It should be sitting to hold this government to account.
A demand echoed by the Labour leader.
We will continue to press for Parliament to be recalled so that we can question the Prime Minister onto why he seems still unable to give an undertaking that he will abide by the European law that we passed last week, requiring him to seek an extension, if necessary, to prevent a no-deal crash-out.
It does strike me that if Parliament is recalled, then all we're going to get is another few weeks of the antics that we saw on Monday night. That was a shame for Parliament, and it shamed our democracy.
There was even a point today where the Lord Chancellor, the cabinet member responsible for the independence of our courts, had to intervene to confirm his confidence in the impartiality of judges. That was after Number 10 sources were quoted wondering why this case was heard here in Scotland and accusing the judges of being politically biased. Well, there was a furious backlash, and Number 10, disavowing those remarks, then confirmed that, yes, the Prime Minister does have total confidence in the independence of the judiciary. Are Scottish judges politically biased?
Nobody who is serious thinks that Scottish judges are politically biased in any way. To cast aspersions on the independence of the judiciary generally, but also give the impression that somehow in particular Scottish judges are politically motivated and politically biased. It's outrageous.
What do you say to Boris Johnson right now?
Recall Parliament.
Parliament is accordingly prorogued.
The government is instead appealing and may take heart today as the High Court explained why it rejected a similar legal challenge last week. It found proroguing Parliament is a political matter. So now it's for the Supreme Court to have the definitive say next week, a hearing of thunderous consequence.
Well, now we're joined here in Downing Street by our political editor, Gary Gibbon. Gary, how did the Scottish decision go down behind the black door?
Well, one individual, not unacquainted with that building, maybe a bit adrenaline-fueled, gave a quotation to a newspaper earlier that the legal activists chose the Scottish courts for a reason. Well, that whipped around the legal establishment like a bushfire of concern, because it sounded like they were impugning the independence of the judges who made this decision. It ended up with Number 10 and the Justice Secretary putting out statements that the government supports the independence of the judiciary. It's come to something. You know, you're in a sticky place when you're having to actually proclaim that. And I think in legal circles, there's a lot of concern that we could have echoes of what happened over the Article 50 proceedings at the Supreme Court, when some judges were pretty much vilified by sections of the press and the government didn't really stand up for them. Will the Supreme Court, when it comes to the ultimate court that decides, the ultimate UK court that decides whether the Scottish court was right, will it back their judgment? If it does, then Parliament will be back. There'll be Prime Minister's questions, not the People's question time the Prime Minister was looking at on a mute iPad, but something a little bit more challenging than he did a couple of hours ago. There'll be questions potentially from select committees. There could be much more pressing harrying of the government on this whole question of how they want to see the texts and the emails, private and public, of the staff in there who've had anything to do with Brexit, anything to do with prorogation. They could think of other ways of harrying the government, but those people who know their way round the Supreme Court, who followed it, who look at the High Court judgment that came out today, think it probably, though we can't be sure of anything in this climate, probably won't back the Scottish courts. But you may need to reach for your superlatives again quite soon in terms of constitutional crisis, because all of this could be replayed, magnified, if the Prime Minister ends up with no deal and won't sign the letter that an Act of Parliament now requires him to, requesting a delay to the Brexit date. We know that there is quite a high embarrassment threshold in here when it comes to breaking convention. There have been meetings in there that have discussed the whole idea of withholding royal assent from that very bill that MPs passed, requiring the Prime Minister to ask for a delay. I understand that there were even meetings amongst the team at some point that discussed the idea of a prorogation later than the one we're going through now, potentially around the date of Brexit itself. So we know there is a readiness in there to do the unthinkable, and that adds to the tensions around this legal judgment today.
Gary Gibbon, and he'll be joining us again later in the programme. Matt.
Thanks very much, John. Well, a short time ago, I spoke to the former Supreme Court Judge, Lord Sumption, via Skype from France, and I asked him whether we are now facing a constitutional crisis.
Well, yes, we are, because the government is using the prerogative powers of the Crown in circumstances where it doesn't have a majority in the House of Commons. And since the whole basis on which ministers are entitled to use the powers of the Crown is that they do command a majority of the House of Commons, that's a fairly serious situation, as well as a very unusual one.
And is it your impression that Downing Street is saying to the courts, to the Supreme Court, bring it on, bring this fight on? Because they are fighting a campaign in which they're quite happy to pit Parliament against the people, and one suspects Parliament against the judiciary.
It's undoubtedly part of their pitch that it's the people against Parliament. We haven't yet got to the people against the courts. Maybe we'll get there one day.
Well, you did get there one day, because we had a headline in the Daily Mail last year or earlier this year saying enemies of the people. This was after it was decided by the courts that, that Article 50 should be heard in the Houses of Parliament.
Yes, we've been there before. It wasn't the press's finest hour. We may go there again. I hope not.
I guess the danger is that you have the will of the people expressed through the referendum versus the will of the people expressed through Parliament. And the collision of these two wills is the story of the last 3 years.
Yes, I think there's a lot to be said for that view. But the fact is that our entire system depends on ministers being responsible to Parliament and not directly to the people. If ministers are entitled to exercise the enormous powers of the Crown without being responsible to Parliament, they're effectively responsible to nobody, because they can't ask the people every 10 minutes, do you approve of what we're about? So that if one's going to have government by referendum, one would need totally to change our system, and we haven't done that yet.
How extraordinary is it that the Justice Minister of this administration, Robert Buckland, has to remind the Prime Minister to obey the law?
Well, that is one of his functions. Some Prime Ministers need reminding.
Lord Sumption, thank you very much indeed.
Lord Sumption speaking to Matt Fry earlier. Well, now we're joined from Edinburgh by the SNP MP Joanna Cherry, who, as we've already seen, was at the forefront of the Scottish legal challenge. Joanna Cherry, two countries, two legal systems, two courts of the same standing roughly, and they come to diametrically opposite views. What are we to make of that?
Well, actually, the Scottish court was of a higher standing because that's Scotland's highest court of appeal. The hearing in England was, as I understand it, at first instance. But we are in uncharted territory, and clearly there's room for a difference of opinion here. The judge at first instance in Scotland found against us, but 3 judges in the appeal court in Scotland have unanimously overturned his decision and given very detailed reasons for so doing.
But for any politician in Scotland, surely this also has a bit of a worrying underbelly, in that you could have a situation in which judges now start probing all sorts of decisions that are made by you in Parliament.
Well, judges don't unilaterally probe decisions. They only probe decisions when litigants bring cases before them with probable cause. Now, there could be nothing more important than the question of whether in a democracy it's appropriate for the executive to suspend Parliament, to prevent Parliament interfering with what the government's up to. And as Jonathan Sumption has just said, it's Parliament that holds the government to account. When Parliament's not sitting, the government can't be held to account. Now, if the Scottish judges are wrong, then it is the position that in the British Constitution it is acceptable for the British Prime Minister to suspend Parliament for any reason and indefinitely if he doesn't like what it's getting up to. Now, that cannot be right in a democracy and smacks more of what would happen in a dictatorship. So that's why I think the Scottish judges have got it right, and I would be cautiously optimistic that the Supreme Court, the majority of the Supreme Court, the UK Supreme Court at least, will follow the lead of the Scottish Court.
I suggested earlier in the programme that we're in the midst of a major constitutional crisis. Can you think of any time since the Second World War when we have faced a constitutional crisis of this scale?
No, I can't. Of course, back in almost 5 years ago, in 2014, we faced Scotland, the potential that Scotland would vote to leave the Union. But of course, that was a constitutional referendum, and the British government was pledged to accept the outcome of that referendum. So although the United Kingdom was under threat at that stage, it was under threat through an agreed process. Now it's under threat from a Prime Minister who cannot command a majority in Parliament and so has shut Parliament down to avoid Parliament scrutiny. As I said earlier, that's what normally happens in fascist dictatorships, not in democracies.
But these are desperate times if politicians have to resort to judges to try to sort out their disputes. Do you not feel uneasy about not being able to make a decision as a politician?
I don't. No, I don't, because I've been prevented from making a decision as a politician because Parliament's been suspended. I'm powerless as a politician to scrutinise the British government through parliamentary means at the moment because it's been suspended. And it's important for viewers to remember that it's not just the House of Commons chamber that's been suspended, it's all the work of scrutiny that goes on in the select committees, which is often far more powerful than what happens on the floor of the House. And if you look at it, the huge weight of evidence heard by select committees over the last 3 years is that Brexit is damaging to the British economy and that a no-deal Brexit would be particularly damaging. Boris Johnson doesn't like that evidence, so he's trying to prevent Parliament from hearing it and commenting upon it.
Joanna Cherry, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, now staying with the Brexit fallout, splits at the top of the Labour Party burst into the open today as the Deputy Leader Tom Watson openly defied Jeremy Corbyn by saying there should be another referendum before a general election. The Labour leader wants to have a general election first, but Mr Watson said a new referendum was the only way through what he said was Brexit chaos, adding that his party should now unambiguously be seen to be favouring Remain in the EU. Here's our political correspondent, Paul McNamara.
Where once there was frenzy, now, well, nothing. Parliament's shut, and as the parties have no place to fight with each other, the fights are with themselves. No change on the subject matter though, Brexit. Keir Starmer today delivering Labour's official stance.
A referendum is the only way. And of course, Remain should and will be on the ballot paper, along with a credible option to leave.
Come an election, then Labour will be selling a second referendum, but will not commit to which side they will back. Yet. The Deputy Leader, though, disagrees.
We should unambiguously and unequivocally back Remain. We should back Remain not for electoral or tactical reasons, but because it is the right thing to do for the country at this time of greatest crisis since the Second World War.
The party not only needs to back Remain, but needs to do it before pursuing power in a general election, according to Mr Watson. This afternoon, Jeremy Corbyn showed the fight for Labour's Brexit position is one which will be fought in public.
It's Tom's view. I don't accept it and I don't agree with it. Our priority is to get a general election in order to give the people a chance to elect a government that cares for them, not themselves.
This isn't just some squabble between the big beast and the Labour leadership. Brexit is a crack that runs right through the party. A divide between MPs who represent areas that voted for Brexit, predominantly in the north, and the vast majority of the membership that backs Remain. And both sides believe that the wrong decision will cost them votes in a possible election. There is another group, though, who believes that Brexit needs to happen with a deal, and needs to happen before a general election. Stephen Kinnock is the leader of that group and believes his way could save the party from open warfare. Doesn't all of this really just show that your party is all over the place and unelectable?
I agree. I mean, I think we should have stuck to our guns. We had a clear position in the 2017 manifesto, which is that we would leave the EU, respect the result of the referendum, but leave with a deal. Since then, we've unfortunately allowed the waters to be muddied by the second referendum campaign. And as a result, I think Labour's ended up having more positions on Brexit than the Kama Sutra.
And while Labour are publicly fracturing, their newest opponents are offering the Conservatives collaboration.
There are parts of the country in which we're the challengers to the Labour Party. We would say, give us a buy in those areas, we'll give you a buy in all of the others. And between us, Boris would win a big parliamentary majority. Between us, we'd be unstoppable.
That's a non-compete offer Jeremy Corbyn doesn't have to worry about just yet, as Downing Street has knocked it back. But it's an offer with a clear position on Brexit, something his party, if not him, is all too conscious of.
Well, now the Prime Minister is meeting a delegation of business leaders from Northern Ireland here at number 10. Stephen Kelly is Chief Executive of Manufacturing Northern Ireland. He was amongst them, joins us now. Stephen Kelly, did you tell the Prime Minister that you would not accept no deal?
John, I followed the Prime Minister into the room and through the delegation that was there from Northern Ireland, up onto the stage where he spoke to everyone, back down through all the business people from Northern Ireland. And every single man and woman said exactly the same thing. Prime Minister, we support you, but you must leave on a deal. Leaving on no deal is not an option.
Did he talk about the backstop, putting it in the North Sea, and in the Irish Sea and all the rest of it?
Not specifically. Of course, there is a border already in the Irish Sea, specifically around agricultural goods. And the Northern Ireland business community, whilst we don't want to actually leave on the basis where some sort of regulatory border is created, we're actually prepared because we know we can work through that system.
Did you get any sense at all about what they are trying to do? I mean, he obviously is apparently trying to work for a deal. Did you get any sense of what it might be?
Well, I think we all collectively consume the media and hear the briefings, etc., etc., etc. And I think we're beginning to see the shape of what this looks like. There has to be special arrangements for the island of Ireland. People in Northern Ireland and companies in Southern Ireland have to make sure that the rules that they follow are the same. If they're not the same, then there needs to be a border. The natural place to do that is actually in the Irish Sea. The challenge now is about how two things happen. One is whose rules are taken and how is that managed, and two, where is the constitutional oversight for politicians in Northern Ireland or elsewhere to ensure that that's managed in an appropriate way for businesses in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, precisely because Parliament isn't sitting. We haven't seen much of Mr Johnson today. I mean, what was he like?
He was in very good form, as we'd say in Northern Ireland. He was very entertaining. He spoke a lot about businesses that he'd engaged with in Northern Ireland. In fact, one of our members gave him a hairbrush with his face printed on it, which he was amused by. He made reference to the Titanic, and I think one of the things to remember is the Titanic was okay when it left Belfast, but when it had an English captain, it ran into trouble.
Oh my God, that is a rather telling statement. Well now, so you leave confidently, but not confident of a deal?
Not confident of a deal at this time. The problem we have is that time is so short. There are projects and solutions on the table. The UK has refused to accept those. If it wants to roll back into a Northern Ireland only backstop, we will work with the Prime Minister, politicians at home and others to show how positive that could possibly be, not just for Northern Ireland but for the whole of the UK.
And you are unified and you would be in unity if there were a no deal, absolutely.
The entire business community, agricultural community, civil rights, human rights, trade union movement in Northern Ireland, everyone is absolutely united. We need a deal.
Mr Kelly, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
The daily political drama that is Brexit, the Prime Minister has had yet another extremely difficult day. The action switched today to the courtroom, where Scotland's most senior judges gave a damaging verdict against him. They suggested Mr Johnson had misled the Queen over the reasons he gave for asking her to suspend Parliament. Well, we'll examine the constitutional implications of that in a moment. They said the suspension was unlawful because, in their judgment, Mr Johnson Johnson was trying to stymie Parliament. That prompted instant demands from opposition MPs to recall MPs immediately. The Scottish ruling, though, isn't the final verdict. The stage for the next instalment will be in the Supreme Court in London. An unfolding drama to be continued.
In Edinburgh this morning, 3 senior judges swung their mace at the Prime Minister's decision to prorogue or suspend Parliament.
The advice given by the Government to Her Majesty the Queen to prorogue Parliament from 9th September to 14th October was unlawful, and that therefore the prorogation itself is unlawful.
They said the Prime Minister's advice was motivated by the improper purpose of stymieing Parliament, and that they'd issue an order declaring that the prorogation which followed thereon was unlawful and is thus null and of no effect. Tonight, the Community Secretary defended the Prime Minister's actions in asking the Queen to suspend Parliament.
Well, the Prime Minister has acted entirely properly. He's taken advice, the Cabinet was briefed, the Cabinet made a decision before the Privy Council met, and, of course, this matter has gone to the courts and it'll be decided by the Supreme Court. But there's no suggestion the Prime Minister has acted improperly.
Labour are demanding Parliament's immediate recall.
These are interesting times when courts rule in favour of democracy against a Prime Minister who wants to shut down our democracy.
Other MPs gathered on the steps of Parliament to protest against the suspension of business inside.
It's astonishing that we are even in this situation, that we have a Prime Minister that is so determined to evade scrutiny and accountability that he's prepared to shut down Parliament for 5 weeks at a time of national crisis.
The government says it's disappointed in today's ruling, but until the legal process is exhausted, Parliament will remain closed.
These MPs say it certainly shouldn't be, and they're going to continue working here, all now waiting for the Supreme Court to make its ruling next week. Brexit is stretching the British Constitution in totally unforeseen ways.
The suspension of Parliament had been ruled lawful by the High Court in London because it was a political decision. Now that the Court of Session in Edinburgh says it's unlawful, the Supreme Court will have to adjudicate and will start hearing the case next Tuesday. If it agrees with the government, Parliament remains prorogued. If it agrees with the Scottish judges, the government will have to ask the Queen to recall Parliament. Tonight, a former Supreme Court judge said that's a real possibility.
If you get a government doing something outrageous, and politically there's no doubt that this government has done something outrageous, you tempt judges to start pushing the boundaries out. I think that that is probably what has happened in Scotland. Indeed, in the summary of their judgment, they virtually say that. And there's obviously a possibility that the same thing will happen in the Supreme Court.
Today, MPs were posting selfies in the Commons to show they're ready to resume sitting. But the justices of the Supreme Court will have to sit in judgment first. Carl Dinnan, News at 10, Westminster.
Well, if the Supreme Court upholds the Scottish judge's decision next Tuesday, it'll be the first time the country's highest court has found the Queen has been misled by one of her prime ministers. Trust, of course, between the monarch and a prime minister is a cornerstone of our constitution. The Queen has to be able to rely on the advice she receives for our system of government to function properly.
They began with Sir Winston Churchill and Sir Anthony Eden, and over the 67 long years of the Queen's reign, her prime ministers have governed their way through many turbulent and often controversial moments. But the first prime minister to advise her to act unlawfully, according to today's judges, was her 14th one, Boris Johnson, which makes today's ruling pretty extraordinary. The Queen last saw her Prime Minister at Balmoral when Mr Johnson arrived last Friday for the traditional, if shorter than usual, September weekend stay in the Scottish Highlands. But the Queen was asked to prorogue Parliament 10 days earlier by the Leader of the House of Commons, who made the same journey to Scotland.
People might say this is an undemocratic move.
So they wouldn't know what they were talking about. It's normal functioning of our constitution.
Normal functioning of our constitution might have been what Jacob Rees-Mogg told the Queen during his audience here, but Scotland's most senior judge instead ruled Her Majesty had been misled.
It's a damning judgment to say that the Prime Minister has effectively misled the Queen in asking him to do this. So they will be very hopeful that the Supreme Court rules differently next week so that they're not in that situation. It's a huge headache for the Buckingham Palace as well.
Buckingham Palace itself gave no response to today's court ruling, anxious as palace aides often are to maintain the convention that the Queen sits above politics. But she does act on advice, and the advice upon which the Queen relies most heavily is that of her current Prime Minister.
If the Queen asks for formal advice from her Prime Minister, she's constitutionally obliged to take it. If she should happen in one of the private audiences to give him advice, he is not obliged to take it, which is actually rather a good distinction. Mind you, he'd do well to listen because she's extremely wise and she's been looking at state papers and dealing with these sort of situations longer than his entire life.
The weekly audience between the Queen and the Prime Minister is currently on hold while she is at Balmoral. The Queen will be back here at Buckingham Palace at the beginning of October, shortly before the state opening of Parliament. Then she'll see Boris Johnson face to face for the first time since today's ruling. But just as it was when they met here in 2012 or at any other private audience of the Queen, we will never know what she says to him. Chris Ship, News at 10.
Well, demands to reconvene Parliament right away were given added impetus this evening when the government bowed to MPs' demands and published its secret documents about the worst-case consequences of a no-deal Brexit. They suggest public and business readiness for a no-deal Brexit remains at a low level, which could be made worse by what they call EU exit fatigue. Well, the document also points to potential food shortages, reducing availability and choice of products, increasing prices too, which could impact vulnerable groups. The reliance of medicine supply chains on the Channel crossing makes them particularly vulnerable to severe extended delays. And there are warnings of potential protests across the country, saying there may also be a rise in public disorder and community tensions. Well, Robert Peston joins me now from his studio ahead of his programme a bit later. Robert, some of this had been leaked a couple of weeks ago, but seeing the official documents is pretty stark, isn't it? What did you make of them?
So, I mean, this demonstrates why the Prime Minister constantly says he would rather get a deal than no deal. And the one thing I would just add to what you have said about this document is, yes, it is described as a worst case, but it's described as a reasonable worst case. In other words, you know, desperate uncertainty for British nationals living in the rest of the European Union, shortages of food, shortages of medicine, some foods going up in a way that particularly hits the living standards of poor people. These are all things that may well happen. Now, you know, I've just interviewed for my show, which you can see very shortly after the news, Robert Jenrick, who's a member of the Cabinet, and he said to me that, you know, the government is continuing to take steps to try and eliminate these risks, and within a matter of days, he said to me, they would publish a new assessment of, in essentially, the reasonable worst case. But, you know, the truth is, and the Prime Minister knows this, a no-deal Brexit will be a shock. And the only issue is how bad a shock and how painful for us.